came on because
Oh, Bill.
No, this morning.
I was freezing.
I was here early.
It's
really terrible.
You know any of these people? Sociology.
You know, I don't know her personally. I know this is with
You know Isaac though?
Yeah, I'll say what I was gonna.
History is definitely adjacent to the war, I feel like, but.
I thought sociology was too. Like,
But you're also legal, so.
Like literally writing about them.
when I was applying, there are not many political implications in my research. I had to like make them up.
Well, actually, Alexander back at the topic. He was like, oh, I wish I could. I was like, that's okay.
I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, dude.
I'm gonna call him.
That's okay. I think it's awesome.
He was, I think he was, because it's almost weird.
It should say, wow. But they have another one.
Something came up, I'm sure.
What do you mean?
Oh, a couple years, right?
Well, no, it's just. He had his job.
I got hot like I think like that right now.
I know that.
And then I think they were, a few years ago, they talked about it, but I think at the time it wasn't.
I guess I.
Yeah, he told, they were interested in.
How was the
Oh my
conflict?
gosh, the class.
The
It was
advice
great.
on-
Oh, I did take public training compliment there. I did not learn. It was really fun. It was like 8 hours. Talking about which.
Okay,
But you're into that, but even by the end, I was like seriously running out. There was like a very slinky discussion after.
That's actually another.
My boss like drove me back to my room.
Because I have a RA in sociology student. Also, I was like, there's a very mobile.
I was working on
I was
a.
like thinking about like my grad school, I was like, I better like sociology.
I was getting the letters of
The ones that do like don't like hey, if you see
surprising you did when you bumped the 3 class. Immediate explanation as to actually under.
Yes.
Oh my god.
The compliment.
I think only.
Yeah, I know.
So like 220.
I took mine of that.
Okay.
Good luck. So I was like, I don't have people to write me letters that care about me that much. Yeah. What about 500 bucks for this?
Oh. Yeah, you should.
Okay, I literally
I was waiting, I was like hesitant and.
Feel free to read it.
So we gotta say something.
Oh.
No, it's good you said
Say
that.
something else.
That was what I was getting.
Oh, thank goodness. We should have texted each other.
Wait, well, now you're thinking who's. What are you scared?
I just like, gonna say that we weren't that bad.
I could ask.
And
them.
not accept it, yeah, so that was just, right, or at least what I was talking, right?
What if he knows? I don't know.
I don't want to be known to you.
Are you recording the screen?
Yeah,
Okay.
The owl speaks.
Moses figures off. Because,
Is that what's on their screen or what?
yeah.
Good morning, Bill and Patrice.
Once it starts, you know.
Hi, guys.
Good morning to you.
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Where are they?
We can.
Very
Yeah.
fantastic.
More that way.
I think that's all the way up.
Tom got
I wouldn't.
So we're about to get started. Fantastic.
All right.
Another quick change for us. Let's start this for everybody.
Billy, you look good.
I'm trying. I'm going to let Catherine and Patrice do the talking, but my voice is fading.
And John too, if he's there yet.
I don't see them yet. Not yet.
Oh, yeah. Sweet. What kind is that?
He lost.
Give them.
get started.
Asheville and Patrice.
Do you know if they're on their, hey, Bill, hey, Patrice?
They are.
They are on their way,
Right.
but John hasn't been there a long time. Hopefully he'll find his way there before you're done.
Okay.
What's your
Yeah.
weather like?
Freezing, it feels like.
Yeah,
We shouldn't complain, but 42 degrees feels colder here, I think.
oh,
Wow. That's
that is cold. You should get ahead. You should start.
They're on their way. Was Christine gonna meet them somewhere?
Do they have a parking pass instructions, all that? Yeah, okay, yeah, we will make sure to shepherd them in when they get here. All right, so why don't we get started? My name is Eric Schickler, co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our virtual and in-person ceremony to honor the recipients of the Percy-Synar Award. This is our 16th annual ceremony with these awards. Yeah. IGS started these awards in 2007 to support exemplary graduate student and undergraduate student research. Counting this year's recipients, we've awarded 69 Synar Awards and 86 Percy Awards. The Mike Synar Graduate Research Fellowship provides graduate students with a $3,000 research grant, and the Charles H. Percy Undergraduate Grant for Public Affairs Research awards undergraduate students with a $500 grant. The Percy and Synar Awards play an important role in helping IGS fulfill its mission of helping our community and the nation gain a greater understanding of American and California politics. We're fortunate to be joined today virtually by the people responsible for establishing these grants, Bill Brandt and Patrice Bougalis Brandt. Welcome. I want to say a few words about Bill's extraordinary support for IGS over the years. Bill played an integral role in launching our National Advisory Committee, and as an NAC member and then its longtime chair, Bill ensured that IGS could thrive even as the university as a whole went through some tough times financially and otherwise. Despite his incredibly busy schedule, Bill always found time for IGS. He was a person we could, the person when we faced a problem or hard decision, and he'd get back to us immediately with sage advice and an action plan. Now, one of Bill and Patrice's many lasting legacies for IGS has been their creation of the Percy and Synar Awards. They created these fellowships to honor Congressman Mike Synar of Oklahoma, a public servant who worked closely with Bill on bankruptcy reform legislation and also became a close personal friend of Bill, and to honor their home state senator, Charles Percy of Illinois, for whom Patrice worked as a press secretary, really in some ways her start of involvement in politics. Percy and Synar were excellent public servants focused on finding bipartisan solutions to difficult problems, and they were not afraid of taking political risk to do so. Synar famously, voted for some very controversial gun control legislation that, he felt was needed for the country, but then, had to face political consequences for that in Oklahoma. Percy was really one of the bravest Republican senators standing up when Watergate happened, calling for Nixon's resignation, among other things. So these were both, independent-minded, brave public servants. And they point to a model of public service that we need more of in this country. And by supporting some of Berkeley's best students, Bill and Patrice have helped nurture a new generation that will live up to that ideal. Now, this past year, in recognition of Bill's tireless support for IGS, the campus named the graduate student carols in his honor. After the ceremony, I encourage you all to check out the plaque in Bill's honor right outside the carol space. And that's really, for many decades, really, since long before I got here, been the kind of hub or center for our grad students, which themselves are a kind of focal point of IGS and its mission. So I want to thank Bill and Patrice for their support of these grants over the last 16 years and being such steadfast supporters of IGS. I was going to turn it over to them if they wanted to give a greeting to the audience.
Go ahead.
We're just thrilled that we're continuing this tradition, and we hope we can do it for years to come. It's quite an honor that you've given Bill, naming the carols after him. And we're always amazed at the quality of the students and really enjoy reading the research that they do.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks. And maybe give a. So today, we're going to be hearing brief presentations from all of our awardees. We'll start with the undergraduate presenters, and then my co-director, Christina Mora, professor of sociology, will introduce the graduate award winners. So the Charles H. Percy Undergraduate Grant for Public Affairs Research, as I noted, is awarded each year to 4 outstanding undergraduate students engaged in research on an aspect of American politics or public affairs broadly understood. So I'm going to invite up our first presenter, Monica Gao, whose project is Protecting Our Kids' Education and American Dreams, Ethnic Civic Organizations Mobilization of Chinese Americans in the San Francisco Board of Education Recall. Monica.
Hi everyone, my name is Monica. I am a fourth-year sociology major, and the title of my project is Protect Our Kids' Education and American Dream, the role of civic organization in the mobilization of Chinese Americans in San Francisco. So my research is a case study of the school board recall in San Francisco that happened in last year. So the recall campaign originally started in 2021 after prolonged school closure. And the campaign collected enough valid voter signature to put a special recall election in 2021 of last year. And the voters had the option to remove 3 of the school board commissioners, and each of them were removed by an overwhelming majority of the votes. And worth notingly, it was the first successful recall in San Francisco since 1914. And the participation rate for Chinese Americans was especially high. And that brings us to my research question, which is, what role did civic organization play in mobilizing Chinese immigrant voters during this successful recall? And secondly, what accounted for the heightened passion for Chinese Americans and otherwise apolitical group, according to political science literature, in a contentious political campaign? So my methodology is in-depth interviews of 5 key informants who were all leaders of the recall campaign. So first of all, I found that although the leaders were motivated by different factors to create the campaign, they shared a list of cross-cutting grievances against the school board. So first of all, one of their biggest complaints was that in 2021, while schools were still indefinitely closed from the pandemic, the school board decided to rename 44 schools in the district, whose names honored figures linked to racism, sexism, and other injustices. And a third factor is that the school board also decided to change the admission system to Lowell High School, which is the most prestigious high school in San Francisco. And Lowell traditionally had a merit-based competitive admission system, but in 2021, the school board decided to implement a lottery-based system. And a fourth factor is the budget deficit that the school board is facing. Last but not least, one commissioner in particular has made racist comments against Asian Americans on her Twitter account, and she refused to apologize after those tweets were discovered. So the leaders conceptualized their success in multiple layers. So first of all, the leaders viewed the action of the school board as an attack on immigrants' American dream. So especially with the decision to change admission system to Lowell High School, because Lowell High School has provided high quality education in a public school, which was traditionally seen as a gateway to success for immigrant children. And second of all, the campaign is a grassroots action. So all of those leaders, they are immigrants or children of immigrants. And it was their first time participating in a political campaign. So they know what the people really wanted, and they are coming from the grassroots for the people. And certainly, the leaders and organizations made concerted efforts to break down barriers for immigrants to participate. So they have organized a lot of tabling and registration events, and some of the volunteers would even hand deliver the petition and to the immigrants' home addresses. Last but not least, is that they did not conceptualize their campaign as a political campaign. So the leaders understood their campaign as protecting students' education from a school board that is making political advances at the expense of their children's future. Through their experiences with a hypocritical school board and the elected officials, the interviewees began to develop a negative perception of politics. So they conceptualized the campaign as simply community work. Also related to the conceptualization of grassroots action, the recall is not a political campaign because it represents the overwhelming will of the people when elected officials and their policies have often failed to do so. So the recall leaders have constructed a dichotomy between political and apolitical. While the political is evil, self-serving, and detached, the apolitical is constructed to be pure collective will and coming from the grassroots. Interestingly and paradoxically, the apolitical becomes politicized in its very construction, exercised by the political outcome of the recall. So what is the significance of this case study? So ethnic civic organization has played a key role in mobilizing Chinese immigrant community for the recall. They spread information about the issue and provided direct guidance on participating. Being a part of the immigrant community themselves, the recall leaders knew the reservations and obstacles faced by immigrants. So they have the knowledge of how to effectively address their concerns and took the extra step to make their participation as easy as possible. In the absence of mobilization from institutions, ethnic civic organizations provided effective channels of immigrants' political socialization. And I have two public policy suggestions. The first is to provide more funding to pre-existing ethnic organizations' civic engagement projects. And second is to provide more civic education and voter registration drives in ethnic enclaves. However, after my research, there are still challenges and puzzles. So first, it's more concerned with from the public policy perspective. So how can we translate single issue-based mobilization into sustained political participation? And second question is more related to scholarly literature. Why certain particular issues garner large-scale attention within the community, within the immigrant community versus another? And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Congratulations, and we have this certificate to present to you. Next, we have Aaron Perry Hill. Present his project is the law and public rhetoric of queer persecution in mid-century California. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Hill. I'll be presenting the work from my senior honors thesis in the history department under Professor David Hankin. There you go. So a bit of context about this first that I want to cover is the Lavender Scare.
The Lavender Scare was a process that went alongside what we typically call McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare in the United States. So while at the federal level, alleged communists were being persecuted by the House and the Senate, at the same time, there was a larger number of people accused of being homosexuals being removed from the State Department and other parts of the federal government. The rationale around this revolved around two ideas. One, that homosexuals in government sapped the vitality of men and institutions who were supposed to defend the nation in the Cold War. And two, that homosexuals were more easily converted to become communists, or that they would be more easily blackmailed as homosexuals to act against the state. And we can see from the data of this that actually it was a far larger number of people who were dismissed from the State Department for being homosexual than for being communist throughout this period. And the State Department was the focus of both the Red and Lavender Scare in the 1940s and 50s. My questions and intervention in this is whether the Lavender Scare was focused at the federal level, whether it filtered down to the states, and specifically in my case, to the state of California. We want to see then, we know there was persecution of queer people that spiked in California in the 1950s and 1960s. Was it specifically attached to the rhetoric of the federal Lavender Scare? And if not, what was the law and what was the rhetoric that justified this persecution? So one of the most obvious examples we can find is the military persecution of gay men in California. So obviously this is still by the federal government itself. However, it is occurring in the state, particularly in California's port cities that hosted a large number of military men. In San Francisco, we see this particularly strongly, where a group known as the Senior Armed Forces Disciplinary Control Board worked with state and local authorities to set bars and taverns as off limits and out of bounds to servicemen. Now, when the Senior Armed Forces Disciplinary Control Board approached the state with this, they said it was to get venereal disease under control for these people, for the servicemen in particular. However, if we look at the actual reasons given for the bars that were actually put off limits, we see that the plurality of them was actually for the presence of homosexuals in those bars. And that there was then a variety of other reasons, of which venereal disease was really a small amount. And so they're cloaking this form of persecution under this other reason. And that's in 1953. Now, the state of California initially resisted this move, particularly through the State Board of Equalization. But in 1953, the legislature moves to create the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. The Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control then, for more than a decade afterwards, became the state's principal arm of queer suppression and queer persecution in the state of California. The primary means of this were through mass arrests at bars and the revoking of liquor licenses of gay bars. The revoking of liquor licenses may seem like a minor thing, but in the 1950s and the 1960s, gay bars continued to be the center of gay life in these cities. Local police were critical to this, and in particular, there's evidence that the San Francisco Police Department, under then District Attorney and later California Governor Pat Brown, eagerly participated as early as 1947, even before the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control was founded. This is a photo taken from the time of people, many of them in drag at a gay bar, and these are their arrest records immediately afterwards. The reason given for this is that it was lewd, obscene, indecent, and immoral nature, particularly for, quote, male persons dressed in feminine clothing, again, what we would call drag today. The liquor license of that bar was revoked, and these people spent time in jail and were heftily fined by the state of California. This is a typical pattern of enforcement. This is not an outlier example, it is a frequent example. Overall, the rhetoric used here is similar to that lewd and indecent nature. It is that homosexuals and drag costuming offended public welfare and morals. This breaks with the national Lavender Scare rhetoric, where the Lavender Scare was concerned about the infiltration of communists into the United States government. Here they were worried about public welfare and moral, threatening that prototypical heteronormative heterosexual family of the Cold War that was so critical to the vision of the United States. We see this over and over again in the state law at the time. The state courts insisted that while you could not arrest someone simply for being homosexual, if there was a homosexual act that again offended public welfare and morals, it was free game. And in codes like the Business and Profession Code, they press on this time and time again, with one of the most famous examples being the Black Cat Bar in San Francisco, a case that went all the way to the California Supreme Court in Stoneman v. Riley. My research so far on this has focused on the bureaucratic records of these institutions, legislative records, as well as those court cases that were on the previous slide. Huge thanks go out to the State Archives in Sacramento here, which has been instrumental to the research. My continuing research will be looking at personal papers of key players in this, including Pat Brown, a governor, and George Christopher, a mayor of San Francisco, as well as the newspapers of the state throughout that time, to better understand the rhetoric of this period and why this was being pursued. A lot of that is going on right here at the Bancroft Library, where the records are held, as well as the San Francisco History Center. I think the reason this is particularly relevant to the public affairs nature of the Percy Award is mirroring what's going on then with what is going on now. Back then, we see accusations that communists were turning people into homosexuals and that sex perverts, which is code for homosexuals, had to be expelled from the city. And again, we see the same kind of rhetoric today with the transgender moral panic that we see from the American right concerning teachers, the media, big technology companies, again, turning kids trans and having to fix this in American society, which is similar to what we saw in the 1950s and 60s. Thank you all so much.
Congratulations. I appreciate it. So we could actually ask them to stand there. Sure.
Thank you. All right. Our next awardee is Sanjana Manjeshwar. Her project is Agreements in Name Only, How Workers Understand Mandatory Arbitration Clauses and Class Action Waivers in Employment Contracts.
Unfortunately, more like his mother.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be sharing a little about my honors thesis research about mandatory arbitration agreements and employment contracts. Before I begin, I wanted to thank my advisor, Professor Catherine Alveston, and I wanted to take a second to remember Professor Lori Edelman at Berkeley Law, who ran the legal studies honors program. She helped me develop this project. She wrote my letter for this grant, actually. She tragically, unexpectedly passed away 2 years ago, and I really wish she could have been here. There we go. So my research question is, how do people understand the effects of mandatory arbitration agreements and class action waivers in employment contracts? And that may be an unfamiliar phrase, so I wanted to begin by providing some background on the issues. Mandatory arbitration clauses are clauses in contracts that require people to give up their right to sue a company in court. Instead, if they've been harmed, they must use arbitration, which is a form of private, closed-door, alternative dispute resolution outside of the legal system. Most mandatory arbitration agreements also contain class action waivers, which ban people from bringing class action lawsuits and coming together as a group to collectively confront a company. Instead, they must pursue their claims individually. Mandatory arbitration clauses are very common. If you've ever bought a cell phone, opened a bank account, signed paperwork for a new job, chances are you've probably agreed to one. My research specifically focuses on mandatory arbitration clauses in employment contracts, which are very prevalent. Over 60 million workers have agreed to them, and most large companies use them. So to examine this question, I'm conducting a survey experiment where I present respondents with a hypothetical employment contract containing a mandatory arbitration clause and class action waiver. And after asking them to read it, I asked them questions about what they would be able to do under the contract. I have two variable conditions. Respondents will be randomly assigned either a conventional standard form arbitration agreement or the same agreement, but with some short bolded explanatory language at the end of it. And here are some of my example questions. I won't read every word in the interest of time, but in some, I'm trying to answer whether people understand that agreeing to a mandatory arbitration clause entails giving up their right to sue their employer and to join a class action lawsuit. So I don't have many concrete findings yet. I'm still pre-testing my survey, but I have found that people are largely unaware of what they're agreeing to, and they think they have legal rights they don't actually have. Mandatory arbitration clauses and class action waivers are often concealed in fine print and full of complex legal jargon, and people just don't understand what they're agreeing to. However, when they're told about what mandatory arbitration agreements are, people then express very unfavorable opinions towards them. They've described them as unfair, sneaky, biased in favor of employers. I've also found that clear explanatory language at the end of an arbitration agreement does impact how people understand these clauses. They're more likely to comprehend that they can't sue their employer or join a class action lawsuit. And finally, many people express that when faced with the choice of signing a mandatory arbitration agreement or declining a job, they would still sign the agreement because they need the job. And this highlights how these aren't really agreements. Workers are coerced into giving up their legal rights because the alternative is being unemployed. Next, I wanted to discuss the motivations behind my research. Existing research on mandatory arbitration is very legal. It's mostly confined to law reviews. This is not a topic that people are usually familiar with. I only knew about it because I was a legal research assistant, and there is especially not a lot of existing research on how everyday people understand these agreements in the first place. And of the little research that does exist, it mostly focuses on consumers, not workers. So my research will fill this gap in the literature and hopefully also make this topic more accessible to the general public. At first, mandatory arbitration might seem like this very obscure procedural issue, but it has massive real-world implications. Mandatory arbitration agreements and especially class action waivers allow companies to avoid consequences for violating workers' rights. Individual arbitration can be very expensive and time-consuming, and when you can't join a class action lawsuit, you might just suppress your claim and not want to do anything at all. And with class action waivers, harmed employees can't achieve broad systemic change or force a company to change its practices. I'm especially interested in the potential social justice implications of my research because low-income workers and workers of color are more likely to experience workers' rights violations such as wage theft or unsafe working conditions, and quote, low-wage jobs are also more likely to subject their workers to mandatory arbitration agreements so they can't sue their employers. And this kind of demonstrates how these agreements reflect and reproduce existing social inequalities. So broadly, my thesis asks, when people don't read or understand the terms of contracts, can they really meaningfully consent to its terms? And what does this reveal about the unequal power dynamics between workers and corporations? And finally, my research is especially salient at this moment in time because the movement to end mandatory arbitration is gaining speed. Here are just a few recent political and legal developments in this area, most notably the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act, which will allow survivors of workplace sexual harassment to finally hold their employers accountable in court. And my project fits into all of this by providing insight into what workers know about mandatory arbitration and its consequences, which can help inform the increasingly mainstream debate about ending mandatory arbitration. And that is all.
All right, and then our fourth and final Percy Award winner is Eva Michaela Polovina, The Impact of Immigration Policies on International Students' Decision-Making, a Comparative Analysis of the US and Canada.
Hi, I'm Evan. Today I'm going to be sharing information about the research that I plan to do in the future. I plan to research the factors that influence international students' decision-making when it comes to attending college in a particular country and deciding to stay in that particular country. So a bit of background, my own personal background and the background that I've done research on. So I am an international student from Croatia, and I know the factors that influenced my decision when it came to studying in the US. I was really drawn to like the culture, the people, and of course, like the academic prestige. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about certain factors that might discourage some people to like come to the US. They did not influence my decision, but I know they do influence a decision for a lot of people. And then I've also noticed in my international student friends that they're kind of like unsure about their possibility of staying in the country and if they want to stay in the country considering the political climate. And then I've done some research and I've noticed that the number and the percentage of international students in the US has dropped during COVID, but even before COVID. But for Canada, it actually increased by 52%. So that's a really large difference, which led me to the question of, why are we seeing this difference? Why is there like a decline in international students in the US and an increase in international students in Canada? And what factors influences decision to attend college in a particular country or maybe stay there? So I have a few hypotheses. I'm not sure if they're true, but I want to do research on that. So I believe that the friendliness of immigration policies to international students specifically really affects their decision to come to a certain country and stay there. So in Canada, we see there is like a direct pathway towards permanent residence for international students. In the US, it's very different because it's really hard to get a work visa, and student visa is a non-immigrant visa, so it's much more difficult to stay. And I believe that would definitely influence international students' decision to attend college in the US and Canada. Then we have the political climate. What is the opinion of international students staying in the country after graduation, from the key political leaders? And I know that some of the US politicians, they wanted to maybe decrease the number of international students staying after graduation, or maybe decrease the number of non-STEM students staying after graduation. Whereas as far as I know, in Canada, there is like a large emphasis on high-skilled immigration, which is not necessarily good or bad, but it does benefit international students. And then a very unique thing about the US work visa laws is that if you're a STEM student and you go to college in the US, you can stay for 3 years after graduation, but if you're a non-STEM student, you can stay for only 1 year. And this is a really big difference because a lot of employers just don't want to take students who can only stay for 1 year, and maybe they don't really have the capabilities to sponsor international students for work visas. So I feel like STEM students would be less affected by the immigration policies, and also like the firms that do sponsor work visas, tech companies and companies that are likely to say STEM students. So those are firms that do sponsor work visas, so I feel like they would be less affected, but definitely still affected, which is also like one of the factors that might influence your decision to stay in the country. Maybe you're going to be more likely to stay if you're a STEM student in the US. But and that also led me to like the additional hypothesis. Okay, if we do know that if you're a STEM student in the US, you're more likely to be able to stay in the country. Does it influence international students, major? Like maybe they're more likely to choose another major or change a major or maybe double major in a STEM degree, so they can stay in the country. So I'm not sure if these hypotheses are gonna be true, but I'm very, very interested and very excited to see what the results would be for that. So next, I'm going to talk about my methods of research. I'm going to be doing 20 interviews with students from UC Berkeley and University of British Columbia, both on the West Coast. So I would be controlling for the confounding variable of East Coast versus West Coast. And in interviews, I'm going to be talking about their choice of major, whether it has changed, why, how did they choose their major, did immigration policies affect their choice to attend a university in a particular country or maybe stay there, and how did the political climate towards immigration affect their decision to possibly stay in the country after graduation. I'm going to be talking to junior and senior students because they probably have more knowledge of what they want to do post-graduation and have had the time to actually find, fit into the environment culturally and socially. And then my conclusion, and just like talking about the significance of this research, is that I've noticed the quotas and work visas have been the same since 1990s. The population of the US and the number of international students and potential immigrants has increased so much since the 1990s, but the quotas still remain the same, which makes it much more difficult to stay in the country after graduation every year for international students and also like other immigrants. And I guess I was really drawn to doing this research because I feel like I recognize the value of international students. And I think a lot of people talk about boosting the US economy, which is definitely true. But I feel like what I've noticed that I think that international students really enrich the learning environment by bringing in global perspectives. And I feel like I've learned so much from both my American friends and my international students friends. And I think that's something that's really valuable about Berkeley education, because it really does have people from all over the world, and I've learned so much from that. And if we continue seeing this decline in international students, it might actually affect the global reputation of the US colleges. Maybe they're not going to be seen as such an attractive choice, and I've definitely seen that with some people from my home country and some of my friends, and maybe it's going to lead to a decline of international perspectives on campus, which I feel like would be a loss. So that's why I think this research is very important, and it can really bring value to this campus, like knowing that not only this campus, but just like to country as a whole, because if we do know that, how are we going to proceed going forward? Are we going to maybe target certain immigration policies or just make the environment more inclusive? So thank you so much for listening. Good research on the topic.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I just want to pause for a moment and just say, like, these 4 awardees, I mean, these presentations were just exceptional. I've been doing this for a long, I've been going to these events for a long time, but I don't think I've seen 4 projects that are just such a perfect fit for the mission of this scholar, he's speaking to important policy and political concerns, public affairs concerns that I know from having talked to Bill and Patrice over the years are the kinds of issues they care about a lot. And, it just makes me smile thinking about what this says about Berkeley as an institution. So you guys should feel good about it. I also just want to note, we're joined in person today by Bill and Patrice's son John and daughter-in-law Gabrielle, so we want to welcome them. And then no, we don't have the Zoom in the background. Their daughter Catherine's in the background of the Zoom, and so we want to thank her as well. It's been great knowing the whole family. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and co-director, Christina Mora.
Great, and pulling up on me. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Moore. I'm an associate professor of sociology, and it's been my great pleasure to co-direct IGS alongside Eric Schickler with and Christine Trost for the last few years now. It's really been a great honor for us. As Eric mentioned, the Percy-Synar Graduate Research Fellowship is awarded each year to 3 outstanding Berkeley graduate students who are writing their dissertation on an aspect of American politics broadly understood. This year, we have 3 fantastic students and presentations here, and our first one is by Bonnie Cherry, who will be presenting on Little Kingdoms, Administrative Power and the Legalized Securitization of Indian Country. Now, Bonnie can't be with us here in person, but from what I understand, she's on Zoom, right? We see her there. So do we need to do something? Okay.
I've got this. I'll share my screen.
Oh, fantastic. Good.
We practiced this in advance.
Yay.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. My dissertation explores extraordinary militarized use of Indian country, land which is legally designated as reservation or allotment land and subject to a body of laws known as federal Indian law and policy. Specifically, my project explores how, in times of supposed national crisis or emergency, or in the name of securing the interests of the U.S., Native people and lands are subject to expropriation or use that non-Native lands simply aren't. Furthermore, I'm interested in how low-level administrative decision-making in the middle of chaotic and legally ambiguous circumstances by military officers, by 19th century Indian agents, by war relocation authority officials, by border patrol, how these decisions create policy, which then becomes reflected by and embedded within actual law. Simply put, what looks like an urgent national security response is often the product of low-level bureaucrats wielding an incredible amount of discretion. In the last 75 years alone, and often against tribal consent, tribal lands have been used to house detention centers for Japanese Americans. They've been used to mine and process uranium, and they've been used to test nuclear weapons and surveillance technology, all in the name of national security. So this leads me to believe that this isn't exceptional or extraordinary land use at all. This violence against Indian country is routine and it is legal. My project is a multi-methods investigation using both ethnographic and historical analysis of securitized space in Indian country and examines the discursive construction of these sites in US law and policy by settler, military, administrative, and tribal actors. Specifically, I'm interested in moments of positive contingency, instances where, in the absence of legal or administrative policy, actors work through mutual uncertainty through interactions among them, producing administrative decisions which become reflected by and embedded within law. This is a process I'm calling legalized securitization. security decisions, ideas, belief, and the bias of administrative officials are later justified in legal reasoning, which is reflected by the courts themselves. So these are some guiding research questions for my project. I'm interested in how Indian country has been constructed as a site of legal securitization and how contested framing is shaping the discourse that constructed it. That's like a mouthful. I'm interested in how successful securitization was facilitated by premises which undergird federal Indian law. To what extent is threat construction either facilitated or resisted by tribal nations themselves? Like, what role do tribes play in either securitizing or resisting their space? And to what extent is securitization facilitated by settler civilian understandings of law and security? So to answer these questions, again, I'm going to the archives, and I've been spending a lot of time in the archives, relying on interagency correspondence, tribal council minutes, memoranda of understanding between agencies. And at my contemporary site, I'm relying on interviews to answer my questions. So although there are plenty of securitized sites in the country, I've identified 3 instances of legalized securitization within Indian country, and I will situate them both historically and legally within the context of specific eras of federal Indian law. So while each of these sites is situated within a historical moment of supposed national security emergency, they're also each situated within a moment during which tribal sovereignty was either expanding or being restricted by federal authority. Now, this is really important to my project for 2 reasons. First, to focus on tribal sovereignty allows me to foreground the agency of tribes and tribal actors in the legal construction of Indian country as a security space. And second, it allows me to explore the role of national security emergency in both the facilitation of extraordinary security measures as well as public acceptance of those measures. So what do we allow to happen in a state of emergency or a state of national security crisis? And so far, it seems like we allow a lot to happen. So I will wrap it up because my voice is going. But I want to thank you, thank you to the Institute for Governmental Studies and to Bill Brandt and Patrice Bougalas Brandt for supporting the Mike Synar fellowships and for supporting my research ultimately. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. We'll have your certificate here for when you get better. And come by. I'd love to see you and give it to you in person. Our next presenter is Isaac Dunk. The title of this project is Making Community Count on Community-Based Violence Prevention and the Past and Future of Alternatives to Policing. Welcome.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Institute for Governmental Studies for this award. And I've greatly appreciated learning about all the research up to this point. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my ongoing dissertation research. I'll be presenting briefly on the motivation and framework for my dissertation on community-based violence intervention and prevention efforts in California, focusing on the policymaking process. So what comes after policing and how do we know if it's better? Since the summer of 2020, with the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police and the uprisings for racial justice and quake, community-based violence intervention and prevention has come to the foreground as a set of policy alternatives to policing and incarceration. Across the US, hundreds of millions of dollars have flown into a wide range of programs under this banner, from street-based conflict mediation to hospital-based interventions to restorative justice initiatives. Many of these programs are not new, and many models championed today, from life coaching to violence interruption, emerged over the same time period and from many of the same actors, organizations, and institutions historically advocating for more intensive policing. So my project aims to understand the relationship between punishment and prevention in the American penal state. And more specifically, my dissertation follows efforts to coordinate policy and funding in California for community-based violence prevention efforts. I ask how policymakers, politicians, nonprofit leaders, bureaucrats, and community members have pursued public support and how they have gauged the success of their efforts. So across federal, state, and local levels, policy around violence intervention and prevention tend to share three common tendencies. So first is they tend to use competitive short-term grant making to decide what to do and who to fund. They rely on community-based nonprofit organizations to provision prevention. And third, they come with hefty data reporting and evaluation requirements in the name of being data-driven. So this is not unique to the world of violence intervention and prevention. And to understand this arrangement, we need to step back and look at the role of nonprofits and modern statecraft more broadly. So scholars take two general approaches to the role of community-based nonprofits in the modern state. First, one camp identifies how nonprofits can create infrastructure for communities to band together to advocate for their interests and to solve collective problems, particularly for groups typically and historically denied resources and shut out of the collective decision-making process. On the other hand, another camp argues that nonprofits actually subvert community voice in political processes, claiming to be true representatives of community while boxing out competitors that title and squashing dissent. So both of these approaches evaluate the relationship between the state and nonprofits in terms of the ability to achieve a more participatory and democratic policymaking process. But if we understand the relationship between state and nonprofits and potential consequences, it's important to note that in many cases, the goal from the policymaking side is something else. And that's how to achieve concrete policy objectives through community infrastructure. So in the context of violence prevention and intervention, more specifically, the central problematic from the policymaker perspective is how to achieve policy goals and reach quote unquote hard to reach populations in the wake of state retrenchment and disinvestment, particularly in working class Black and Latinx neighborhoods. So instead of governing for community, this is a case of governing through community. And embedded within that is a set of tensions between the role of community to decide what to do on one hand, and the demand to see tangible policy results on the other. So my dissertation follows this complex set of dynamics into the entrails of the penal state, tracking policy and funding for community-based violence intervention and prevention efforts across time and place. So I asked how different actors have pursued public support for community-based violence intervention and prevention, and how they have gauged the success of their efforts. I engage a range of methods and data, drawing from interviews, archival materials, and participant observation of public meetings, policy forums, and administrative procedures. I trace this process back in time, looking at the historic trajectory of two extremes of California's political and social landscape, Oakland and Fresno. So on the one hand, Oakland is a kind of quintessential polarized post-industrial city and one of the state's major metropolitan centers. And Fresno is an epicenter of American agriculture and a major historic immigrant destination in a much more conservative Central Valley. Across the place, I trace the state's California Violence Intervention and Prevention Program, or CALVIP, which has administered hundreds of millions of dollars to community-based organizations and their local government partners from San Diego up to Northern California. So over time and place, I trace how money flows, how relationships and partnerships are formed and navigated, how different actors balance the twin demands of community-driven and data-driven decision-making, and ultimately how different actors attempt to gauge and demonstrate the success of their efforts. And in so doing, I hope to illuminate one of the primary ways that the state now attempts to manage social problems in the US more broadly. So I will end things there. Thank you again.
Thank you. And our last presenter is Christian Bosom, who will be presenting with the title Triaging Representation, the Congressional Black Caucus and Anti-Black Governance.
Everybody. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining me today. And two quick things, just first, before even that, thank you to Eric and to Christina and to the whole IGS time on that. I really appreciate the support for the award. The first thing I want to say is congratulations again to the undergraduates who did really wonderful work. I'm like much more than I was when I was an undergrad, so congratulations to you all. And the second thing is I definitely over-prepared for this talk. I have way more slides than I have the time to talk about. I'm going to skip a lot, but don't worry about that. So we're just going to jump right in. Here we go. Back in January, Hakeem Jeffries was installed as the minority leader of the Democratic Party, making history as the first Black person to lead a major American political party. This moment, which places him in a major role as a political broker, can be seen along with several other historic firsts in African-American history as a major moment, not just for him as an individual, but for Black people collectively. So can we look at this moment and think of it as a watershed moment for Black politics? Contemporary research on race and district representation in political science would tell us that this is true. As this quote from a review article on Black representation says, most recent studies have presented preponderance of evidence that Black descriptive representatives are essential for quality Black representation in government. Black legislators are more likely to put policies in place that advance Black interests, introduce Black-focused bills, and ensure Black voices are heard through constituent services. But some other voices might take exception to this. In a recent Washington Post article, Perry Bickenstreet discusses Jeffries almost immediately after his election, going back to New York State to attempt to help New York Mayor Kathy Hochul push through a widely unpopular candidate for a state Supreme Court position, in spite of major opposition from the state's Democratic rank and file. Bacon uses it as a telling story about a portion of Black Democratic leadership that is increasingly hostile to more progressive causes. This, along with the oft-cited irony of the Black Lives Matter movement emerging during the presidency of the first Black president, Barack Obama, seems puzzling given this preponderance. In other words, why do studies of descriptive representation seem to be out of step with more radical demands for change? Skip ahead. Okay, yeah. So, looking at this graph, during the 1990s Republican Revolution, in which Newt Gingrich took over the speakership of the House, Black members who were at their highest number ever in the House at that point were effectively gutted out of most of their power and without committee chairships for a number of years, as you can see here. Oh, sorry. Oh, that said, even as the country's proportion of Black people has remained relatively stable, the number of Black representatives has continued to rise. What this has functionally meant for our studies of descriptive representation is that we tend to focus on their successes and failures and moving through their professional lives, their legislative behavior, and how stable the desire is to have someone in office that looks like you. What I want to do, however, is speak to the fact that I think these types of questions only take us to the water's edge when it comes to knowing what I think underlies our study of descriptive representation. In other words, I think what we should be asking is, does Black representation lead to better Black outcomes? Let's see, slide 10. So, in spite of a lot of the research that suggests that descriptive representation really is helpful and really matters, I think we need to ask some different questions, and I think we need to ask these questions for these reasons. There is an overtime loss in Black political power. We have to right-size the corruption of our Black representatives, and we have to think about policy implementation. Now, I won't talk about implementation in this talk, but that's something I'll talk about in another version of this. In 2008, the CBC Foundation spent more on a caterer for a signature legislative dinner and conference, nearly $7,000 for an event one organizer called Hollywood on the Potomac, then gave out scholarships that federal tax records show. And so we have this kind of a vision of Black caucus members kind of being able to kind of profit personally from their work in the House. We also have this really sobering statistic that shows, from Nicholas Stephanopoulos, that shows that even as there are more representatives in office, Black support for an issue actually predicts the probability of that issue becoming law going down. So 100% meaning full support of something means we can only get 30% of people, 30% chance that that will become law. See, perhaps even most stunning is that for younger Black people that are coming up through the world, the marginal benefit of voting in fair elections seems to be slipping. A 2020 Gen Forward survey run by the University of Chicago and the National Opinion Research Center shows that only 8% of Black respondents think the best way to make racial progress in the United States is to vote in elections. But that's dwarfed by the number that say that the best way to achieve racial progress is through revolution. So put together, I think this means that we just don't know how important Black representation is to the lived experiences of Black communities, for the simple reason that the function and import of discriminatory representation is changing over time. And it's dynamic, meaning that we have to think about how it needs to be dynamic as well. So we therefore need analyses that are sensitive to institutional dynamics and variation, that are to change over time, and have at least somewhat direct relation to the on-the-ground realities of Black people. So to attempt to do this, so I don't know if I'll be able to do this, honestly. We'll see if I can pull it off. My core research question is, do Black members support more advantaged Black people in the place where they have the most individual agency? So what I mean by that is, where we think Black representatives are able to affect change in their individual capacities as representatives, who do they support? Who are the Black people which they support? So to do this, I draw data from usaspending.gov, the national database of federal discretionary spending. And I track individual awards made to programs that are distributed at the congressional district level. I then stratify into districts based on both the race of the member and the racial composition of the district. And then I code the program using a scheme created by Dara Stolovich in a really wonderful book called Affirmative Advocacy, in which she looks at advantaged subgroups, disadvantaged subgroups, and universal policies. The idea here is that, sorry, give me 1 second, I lost my train of thought. Here I look at programs that are receiving the federal dollars and focus specifically on how the proportion of money going to those programs for disadvantaged subgroups is changing over time. Another way of thinking about this is, has the increase in descriptive representation resulted in better lived experiences, not just for those Black people who are already able to move forward, but for those of us that are the most marginalized? So the concept underlying all of this is what I call representational triage. This term, as I see it, is one that helps to bridge the seemingly opposed facts of Black congressional life. On the one hand, they are more responsive to the needs of their constituents in an increasingly hostile environment for policies relevant to Black communities. On the other, they seem to also be more and more entrenched in party politics that are repeatedly ill-equipped to support Black people. As I see it, as the parties polarize and Black members are less able to serve as transformational change agents, they default to the things that both signal their commitment to Black people, but are easiest to get through the policymaking process, triaging representation. And you know what? I'm going to end right there. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, everybody. That was just outstanding, and it reminds us of why we teach here, why we work with the very best that California, the nation, and the world has to offer, and why we believe so much in our public mission here. So it's the work that you all do that inspires us to continue the work that you do, that we do, and to think about the brighter days that are ahead of us for democracy and for the country and for the state. So thank you. I'd like to thank the selection committee members that helped us do this work, that selected the winners, includes Terry Vines and Keller, Armando Lara Milan, Christine Truss, Megan Collins. I'd like to also thank the IGS staff and event organizers, which includes Ezra, who's been fantastic running around here, Megan Collins, Christine Truss, and Luca Marks for helping to plan the event today. We especially would like to thank Bill and Patrice for making all of this possible. Bill or Patrice, do you have any closing words or remarks?
Oh, as always, we're overwhelmed with everything we heard today. So excited. We always look forward to reading these papers when they're finally presented and posted. And in the old days, used to mail them to us, but now they're accessible online. So thank you. Anyway, it's been a wonderful afternoon. We're glad our son, John and Gabrielle got there, and to let you know how important it is to us as a family that you continue giving these Percy-Synar awards.
Agreed.
They were all fantastic. I really enjoyed all of them.
Oh, so great, thank you. And Patrice's words about family remind me about certain remarks that Bill always gives when he's here. I think he reminds the students, especially the undergrads, that we'd like to congratulate you on your great work, but we'd also especially like to congratulate your parents and your family for bringing you to where you are today. We know that many of you might be the first in your family to go to college. Many others of you have immigrant backgrounds, and many others of you, whatever walks of life, your family has been an inspiration for you, and we thank them as well and want to honor them as well here today. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a great afternoon. We've got some refreshments in the back. We'd love for you to stay and hang out and chat with our award winners. Thank you so much, Bill and Patrice, John and Gabrielle. Everybody.
If I could ask the awardees really quickly, if we could step outside, take a group photo of everyone, and then I won't hold you very long at all, and then we'll come back and celebrate. Yes, and bring the awards with you. That's great. That's right. Amazing as always. I don't know what we would do without see the tech.
I know we're still on. They were on.
Moses? Yeah, I think. I don't know if you can hear us or see us, but it's good to see you all. Take care. You really look
Right.
out.
Thanks, Ezra.
Thank you so much for everything you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Yes.
Long time.